let's then just really nail down why too simplistic to say, because this is how we began it with. A lot of Muslims make this very simplistic statement: the Quran is preserved word for word as Muhammad would have recited it, which on its face is incorrect, because if he received it in 7 aruf and we don't have those, then it isn't word for word what he received. And there's no way of verifying if I'm correct or not. There's no way of actually verifying if the written Quran is a mixture of those aruf. Is it just one? Did they choose one out of multiple? So far I'm still confused personally with what exactly is the written Quran in correlation to what was actually received by Muhammad. How can you say that this is word for word what Muhammad received when it's not everything he would have received if it was revealed in different aruf? And if he never commanded it to be written down, if Allah never said you need to preserve it in written form, then is it, written on the hearts? And let's address this as well. They say, well, everything that's memorized today is exactly to what Muhammad would have received, so that's how we know it's preserved word for word. But again, what's memorized is the ʿUthmānic Codex. We've already demonstrated that there were other in the Sahaba that were resistant to that codex and had their own codex, which would have been legitimate recitations that were eventually suppressed. And I've heard guys like Shabir Ali saying, yeah, we kind of wish we would have known how Ibn Masud would have read it, but they suppressed it all. So at the end of the day, and we can go from here, saying that the Quran is word for word preserved as Muhammad would have received it is just far too simplistic and ignores the process that took place. So how should a Muslim understand, and then how can a Christian approach responding to that? How should a Muslim understand the process by which the Quran was preserved? Can they be confident that what they have was probably what Muhammad recited, but it's not that simple as saying word for word what he recited?
So I guess I would say that the impression I get is that people want to shrug off any type of criticism.
Right.
And nuance invites criticism. The human element invites criticism. And a scholar would just acknowledge those things are there and probably reformulate the claim, which would be the accurate way to do things.
Right.
You could reformulate your claim and try to say maybe that everything we have in the Quran today, we know came as an utterance from Muhammad, or we're confident that it was of the utterances of Muhammad. Of course, when you go to the sources, we have things that are missing. So a claim like that isn't claiming that it's complete and has everything that every single revelation inside of it, or that there might be other recitations or anything like that. So reformulating the claim would make it better. But the problem with that is what the whole idea of the polemic is to make the Bible look like a mess compared to a perfectly preserved revelation. And they just don't have that, and they shouldn't. That's not fair play, right?
I think that's the biggest thing. Let's try to maybe go down those two roads there with, it's more or less a statement that is trying to make the Bible look bad while ignoring the actual process of the way the Quran was put together. But let's talk first about that. I think that statement's important, what you said, that the way a scholar would approach it is that they would look at the original sources, try to find out what was actually meant, because meaning never changes, but our interpretation of what was supposed to be meant changes, right? And so what scholarship allows us to do is try to get back to the original intention and meaning of what was written and what would have been understood. Like I'm doing to compare to like Christian tradition. I was listening to a guy who said, the first 1500 years of church history, every Christian understood the Eucharist to be literal. So then I started doing a deeper dive, and the term literal doesn't mean the same thing it meant and they didn't even use the word literal back then. They used a different Latin word that was more like sign versus form, all that. So the point is, I think what you said is important to understand for both the Christian and the Muslim, that a scholar can approach something academically and then reformulate the concept so that it better and more accurately represents the way it was supposed to be understood. But just because something's being reformulated now doesn't mean it doesn't change the integrity of the actual text or the meaning. And so what I'm getting at is, just because maybe scholars today will say, well, we don't know this about the Bible or this, they'll reformulate something. It doesn't undermine the actual text itself. It might undermine an interpretation we have of the text, which means we should be willing to revisit whether or not we truly understood, but it doesn't undermine the authority of the text itself. Now, for secular or atheistic scholars, they already don't view the scriptures as authoritative. So they don't view they're undermining the authority of scriptures, because they don't give the scriptures any authority anyways. But the same applies with the Quran, I think, as well. And we want Muslims to hold themselves to the same standard of the processes that took place on the human, plane. So them saying that the Quran is word for word preserved the way Muhammad received it, it's ignoring the entire process, as we've already talked about. And I think now we are seeing guys like Shabir Ali and Yasser Qadi, they're reformulating and trying, and even I have a video of Yasser Qadi saying that he's trying to figure out how to present this. So he's in the process of reformulating the misunderstanding. Shabir Ali himself said it's the modern Muslim, the common Muslim, that has made the claim that it's word for word preserved, but that's not the scholarly position. So let's maybe go a little deeper into that. Does reformulating a concept, is it undermining the text itself, or is it just getting us back to understanding this is what was originally intended?
Yeah, scholars are trying to get back to what's the best guess at what was being said.
Right.
So that's comparing textual evidences and things of that sort. And so that kind of would be a proofing, trying to prove whether this text has been preserved. We're examining if the text has been preserved. And then the problem is that you get people that are kind of acting in a different spirit. They're trying to perfect the text and protect the text that they have, which is not a scholarly way to go about things. Rather than going back and trying to find the original, they're trying to, get rid of criticism. They're trying to ignore the nuances, and they're falling into sort of the problems that we see in the Quranic preservation, is that they were messing with it. There was a purge. It was purposeful. They were trying to make one text, and that's why the 7 huruf are nowhere to be seen.
Right.
So I think there's a difference, ideologically, at the heart of those two things.
Yeah, and I think that obviously non-Muslim scholars are going to feel a little more liberty in approaching the Quran from that. And there aren't a lot out there there are some, maybe not as many Muslim. I've read some Muslim scholars that are approaching it from that position, but I think because Islam is becoming more prevalent in the West, then Western style scholarship in academia is beginning to turn its focus toward the Quran and its preservation. And I think you're right. What it does is, let's speak to the Christian. Okay, so the Christian, we have all these manuscripts, and there's so many variants in them, and Muslims will say, you guys, they don't agree with each other. Which Bible's the right version, et cetera, et cetera. There are all these objections that, if you actually stop and think about it, they don't disprove the Quran or the scriptures as being untrue or unreliable. I've read Bart Ehrman. I've read other even atheistic scholars who, even though they don't agree on authorship, they do say, because of the variants in the manuscripts and the vast manuscript that we have, the body of manuscripts that we have accessible, and the early dates of these manuscripts, and then even the writings of the early church fathers, if you piece them together, you almost have the whole Bible just in their citations of the New Testament. We can say with like 100% accuracy, confidence, that whoever the authors were, they disagree on that. We know what they wrote and what they originally intended to write. So I guess what we want to impress upon Christians is that scholarship doesn't undermine the authenticity and authority of Scripture. It can actually reinforce it. It's a matter of faith that you believe this is from God. If you start with a worldview that it's not from God, then of course you're going to believe that your findings will undermine the Scriptures and undermine its authority. So the Muslim objection is actually what strengthens to the manuscripts of the New Testament, actually strengthens the authenticity of the scriptures we have. But when you actually take the same concept, like you said, and apply it to Islam, I think maybe why they want it so simplistic is you literally do have humans interfering with the process and destroying any sort of, other evidence to help us get to what was actually written. So I think you can't really, from a scholarly academic consensus, say, we know we have word for word what Muhammad would have given. Is that accurate to say? Just all those concepts.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking, in the background of my mind, what I've toying with is the fact that it seems like if you really believe that this is something that God is preserving, then you just look at the evidence, whether it's preserved or not. If you're trying to preserve it by getting rid of these things, burning manuscripts, and trying to make one particular reading the public reading, the Hafsa, then it looks like that you're trying to make it fit this public image. Right. You're trying to make it into what you want it to be, and that's not faith. That's not trusting in what God has sent down necessarily. That seems to me the opposite. And so what we have today is the reason you have so much criticism and so many people talking about the Bible says this, the Bible says that, is because the Bible, there wasn't a organized purge going on, and they weren't trying to purify it, and they're not really trying to hide anything. They are also trying to understand what was originally said, just like everybody else is. And so we all come to it and we can get the evidence points to over time what we have today matches what we have today is coming from those early texts. And so that's the strength of textual criticism. And it's suspicious when you have a statewide purification. We know that any book has a history, right? And the history of the Qur'an is, if they're going to protect it and they're going to try to build it up into something, they're going to put all this makeup on it, then I think it's eventually going to it's eventually going to do the opposite.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think
it's going to seem fake,
right,
if you examine it with from scholarship,
right? And I guess
so. They need to reformulate.
Yeah,
and
which I think is what's happening.
If they reformulate, then what we have here is we're comparing two different books they're not analogous to one another necessarily. They have different histories, and we can look at what we have. I would say that I think that what we have is probably the recitations that Muhammad passed on. Not all of them, but it's our best guess,
right? And
that there's no really good reason to think to doubt that at least what we have is what our best guess of what that was.
Right.
So
that kind of carries over into maybe something we could discuss, which we were just discussing about earlier, into there's two different mindsets that I think this is where Christians and Muslims kind of talk past each other a lot of times, is because we're using similar terminology, but our concepts are completely different. So even the Islamic concept of preservation and the Christian concept of preservation, we talked about scholarship. Scholarship doesn't, we don't put our faith in scholarship. And so it needs to be placed in the proper category of how it forms our faith. But like you said, it seems like legitimate scholarship of how you study ancient manuscripts is starting to unravel this explanation of Quranic preservation. It's starting to pull that apart at the seams, wiping the makeup off, as it were, and they're starting to reformulate that. And so it'll be interesting to follow how guys are starting to reformulate that, like Yasser Qadi and others who are admitting openly that there are holes in the narrative of how the Quran was preserved, and it's problematic. And they're not saying that it undermines Islam, but they're saying that the scholarship is pointing out that we have problems too. Now, whether they're actual legit problems, I think, as we just discussed, they are legit problems because of the way that they've manipulated the process through the standardization. Whereas all of I think what's going to happen, personally, and then we're going to get into these concepts that are different. But what I think what's going to happen is that as they begin to reformulate how the Quran was put together, they're going to still maintain that this is the word of God. This is what Muhammad received. They might reformulate it, but what it will do is cause them to look at how the Christian Bible has been preserved and give credibility, and it'll destroy at the same time these ridiculous objections to the Bible and, claiming it's corrupt, which is only in turn going to reinforce like the Islamic dilemma that there's a problem here, because we have what was given, to Moses. We have the preserved teachings of Jesus and all of that. So, but that being said, one of the concepts that I wanted to talk about was on the way that Muslims view religion as what is revealed, like the actual structure, and naming it, like, because we just watched the guy who said, okay, you hear it all the time. What religion was Abraham? Abraham was a Muslim. All the prophets were Muslim. Islam pre-existed Islam, which kind of doesn't make sense, but we hear that all the time. So we're not really refuting that. I mean, it might come up as we're discussing it. How do you help a Christian understand when they start a conversation with a Muslim about who's the right religion? You got to know where they're coming from. Otherwise, you're going to be arguing concepts that you're not even on the same page on. So you're just going to be talking past each other. Because if you try, I've never heard until you start engaging a Muslim, you don't really hear Christians arguing that Christianity is the true religion. A true Christian will say Jesus is the way. Like, we're followers of Jesus, and it's not about the actual, like, some religion that was revealed and all these rules of do's and don'ts. So what is the Islamic concept of religion, and why do they claim that Islam predates or pre-existed Islam? And then how does a Christian respond to that?
Well, they say that the true religion is Islam. There's not another. And they kind of rehash history based on the mentality that we find in the Quran, which is there should be obvious separation between the truth and those who are following things something that's not true. So the different ummah, or the different religions, there should be clear lines between them. That's the way Islam likes to see it. And so when they go back through history, they try to cast everything in the light of the idea of Islam, which means submission or surrender. And they tell the stories, casting them in that light. Right. So, like, for Moses, a good example would be, we read Moses, God sent him to set his people free. Right. But the central theme of the Quran is going to be that God is one. He's going there to show the victory of monotheism over these other things. It's not to say that wasn't also a part of what we see in the Torah, but we know that he was sent to set Israel free and deliver them out of the Holy Land. And that was why he was called to the burning bush, and so on and so forth. So they rehash the same stories, emphasizing a theme that can be traced throughout the prophetic history. and then they try to connect it with the present revelation of Muhammad.
So basically, they're saying at its core, Islam as the religion of that God, the core of Islam is a testimony of monotheistic concept that Islam presents of Allah. And I think the biggest difference between Christianity, the Christian understanding, which is what Jesus taught, is that the revelation given by God is a testimony of the Messiah. Jesus said that himself. So when you make a distinction between the religion of the Jews by keeping Torah, there were 600 plus laws they were to keep under this Mosaic covenant that was specifically for anybody living in Israel, part of that nation who was a citizen, brought into that covenant. And anybody could be brought in. You could be a foreigner and brought into the covenant, but you had to abide by the specific restrictions of this religious system. But even that served, all of it, as a testimony to, as Jesus said, a testimony to the Messiah. And so I think that when Christians are discussing that with Muslims, it's important to understand that distinction is that the Christian needs to maintain the testimony of Jesus, pointing them to the Messiah and the importance of Messiah, which is interesting to me how Islam accepts Jesus as being a Messiah figure and yet rejects all the majority of prophecies concerning Messiah, which is what, again, it just completely and fundamentally misunderstands the concept of Messiah. So let me ask you this, for example. Can you define what a Messiah is or why Jesus is called a Messiah just from the Quran?
Well, no. There's confusing tafsirs about this, about things like being flat-footed and things like this that don't have any connection. Linguistically, it seems like they should be able to kind of figure out masha could mean, to rub something. Okay. So that does kind of allude to the idea that we find Mashiach is the one who's anointed. But they don't have a concept of the Messiah as it was developed in the scriptures from, the time of, Adam till Samuel's time, and when they started using the term Mashiach and all that stuff. So they don't have that. So he's just pulling out of it. And like I said, the best way to understand it, if you're not a Muslim, if you want to understand the Quran, he's retelling these stories in a commentary sort of fashion in order to say something about himself, right, for the most part. Right. And so he's casting them in a light that has something to do with what he's doing. He's preaching his message, and he's drawing out of these stories. So there's a big difference in the themes and the way things are presented. And of course, because he was illiterate, he's drawing from sources all over the place. Right. So
because he was initially merchant, he traveled, right? So
right. So you might want to take the Torah and do Moses' life, and you're going through the Moses life and the Torah. He might be picking it from the Talmud and the Torah and other places as well, all at once. And just from conversations of other people.
It's plausible then that he would have heard a lot of these stories in his travels, and even and we're not going to talk a lot about that, but even the scientific miracles of the Quran, where he talks about. I just did a video the other day where they said, "Oh, Islam is true because Muhammad wouldn't have known. Nobody knew that honey is created in the stomach of a bee." And so I looked up the word in Arabic, and it simply means the insides, not stomach. It can mean stomach, but there's a separate sac in the bee that creates the honey. It's not the stomach. And so to translate it stomach is incorrect, but this was knowledge that it's just observation. You can just see they ingest the pollen and out comes the honey.
Right. There's lots and lots of examples throughout the Quran, especially if you're going to go around looking at Quranic miracles. So 300 year BC, we're talking, Galen and all these guys talking about embryology, and they think that there's a male sperm and a female sperm, and they get together and it goes to these stages. We find those stages as this amazing amazing work of creation and described in the Quran. And these stages are not how we understand today. It's
Right.
it's 7th century embryology, public street embryology, right?
But it is, and again, like going back to where this information would have been sourced from, it's again, this is a society that we all know was they orally transmitted these stories. Very few people knew how to read and write anyway. So it's not really that unique that he was unlettered or illiterate, if that's what it means, illiterate. It could also mean, and that's maybe another topic, it could mean like a non-Jew. It was the same word used, right?
That just means he wasn't he wasn't someone who had studied the scriptures
right
beforehand yet.
And so it seems that from a standpoint of looking from the outside looking in, the way it's all compiled is these are things he would have heard in his travels as a merchant. And it's very obvious, like a lot of it's just getting mixed up. And I always try to compare to the scriptures when they called the disciples unlettered, uneducated men. I think Jesus chose those men specifically because they would not have the bias of whatever schools of thought they were a part of, but they would actually approach his teaching without bias. And so what we have in the New Testament is a very coherent and straightforward presentation of who the Messiah is in correlation to what the scriptures teach. But when you look at the Quran, okay, you have the same thing where there's this guy that would have been unbiased because he's uneducated. So he's not following any school of thought, but it's just all over the place.
I'd stop you there. I'd say, why would you say he's unbiased? He didn't come out of a vacuum. Okay. Muhammad's life, he lived in a time where religion was everywhere. Right. And Mecca had all sorts of people in it. Right. Waraqah was, translating things into the local languages. He was sharing things from the Bible as we know it. And the other books outside the Bible were all around. They had the Jewish communities around. All these people are interacting. We know they're merchants. They're going back and forth. They're going to Sham. That's where we find all these large Christian communities that are discussing all sorts of things. He was inundated with ideas, and he was interested in those ideas. He wasn't the first one to come up with, monotheism, or like maybe we should get away from these idols that we're following at the Kaaba. So there was other guys that had this idea as well. And there was the religion of Hanifism, right, at the time. And that was strictly, sticking with Abraham, right? And that's what he says about himself, that he was following the way over Abraham. Right. And so we know that he was inundated in thinking about all these things early on. So there's no reason to say that there's no reason to say he wasn't biased. He definitely had things that he thought, and it developed over time as with his interactions with people. Right. We see a big change when he moves to Medina as well. So there's a lot of things, different influences, especially if you read the Sirah, you can see the interactions, how they affected everything. So I would say, yeah, he wanted the approval of the people of the book, right? And he assumed that these books affirmed his revelation. And so that's why we find all these verses talking about affirming the Bible, saying it talks about me. Yeah, these guys are following Allah, and that's what I'm talking about. The one following the one God, and kind of like using them as a tool to reach these other communities, I think, in one respect. Okay. He considered himself a continuation of them, but there really is he was illiterate, and so he's not continuation from the books as we know it, or the books as they knew it even. He considers him a continuation of what he understands these things to be. Right. Which is what. And so he's interpreting his own ideas onto these things. Right. Which if you're not a Muslim, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because he's not literate. He can't understand. He can't read the books and check himself on these things. So all he can do is hear the stories and take it from his perspective. And so every story has that Islamic flavor to it. So we don't find the Old Testament, the New Testament talking about we follow this religion, or anything like that. But that's how Muhammad talks, and that's how he casts everything. And we could go through literary devices in the Quran where the ways that he speaks when he tells the story from from one of the prophets, he says it a certain way. Like he'll have the person in the story narrating the story. Right. That's a style of the Quran that, the prophet didn't actually describe everything that was about to happen. Or Jesus didn't describe his life and all the things he was about to do when he spoke as a child, even in the infancy gospel. You know what I mean? Right. Yeah, but that's the style that Muhammad spoke, and so he reads that in to the previous messages.
And because of these discrepancies that are, just blatant discrepancies between the original source material and the way he's interpreting it, if you say it that way, that, this is just his interpretation, way he's reading into it, then it obviously is problematic for it being from Allah, which is why Muslims will say that, like, there's a verse that says the Quran becomes a criterion for, is it what's written or what came before it? And what does that actually mean then? And to me, it just seems too convenient that, okay, I'm going to make up all these stories, make them about me, which again, the way it's being described, and as I read the Quran, it's true. It's like in every context of something he's talking about, it's so a lot of it's so random. He'll be talking about Jesus, and then all of a sudden he's talking about Moses, and all of it's pointing to something in his context. So like, we sent Jesus to confirm the Torah and to make lawful that which was forbidden. But that's exactly what he was doing. So of course he's going to have Jesus doing it. And then it goes to Israel confirming Moses as a prophet by asking him about a heifer and what it's supposed to look like and all that. And this is just Surah 2, like so their questions, which again, they question him. What should it look like? It should look like this. What color should it be? It should be brownish red. What should it do? Like, how do we know? And then after he answers like 3 questions, they say, now we know you're from Allah. But it's like, I read that in Surah 2 and I think anybody could give an answer. Well, like, it doesn't even make sense how that affirms divine origin, which I think is why a lot of Muslims have a problem with actually proving divine origin. And maybe let's go this direction, proving the divine origin of Muhammad's prophethood and divine origin of the Quran itself, because from the outside looking in, it does look like just a mess of different sources that he would have heard, and he's putting himself in the story, which if Jesus said they're a testimony of him, and Muhammad's now making a testimony of Muhammad, there's no other way for a Christian to interpret it. It's anti-Messiah literature. He's replacing Messiah. He's replacing Jesus, which the New Testament calls antichrist. And I know you can't lead with that when you're talking with a Muslim, but that's clearly what's happening here. And maybe later I'd like to get more into some of the other literature, how he actually takes titles that are designated to Messiah. But that being said, when a Muslim looks at it, they're going to say, well, the Quran corrects all that. How do they phrase that? And then how is that problematic?
Well, I don't get a lot of that here.
Okay.
They basically, you have people who nowadays have gone back and looked at the previous scriptures and realized just how different they are.
Right.
And that basically these are not the sources for the text we have in the Quran. Okay. So I would say that just outright from my perspective. If you're going to ask my perspective, yeah. I do not consider the New Testament and the Bible as we know it as the major source for these stories. Like he's drawing on a lot of different sources.
But does that imply that the Bible as we have it today is after Muhammad? Because a lot of Muslims will say, yeah, you have a Bible that's been changed. Muhammad's sources were the legit sources. You have a corrupted Bible. Now, that's the implication they'll make, but well,
no, because these sources all draw from stories that are drawn out of the Torah. So the Talmud is based on the Torah, and some of these in the infancy Gospels and so on and so forth, where we see a lot of these stories coming from, were all part and parcel. They draw from the scriptures or later works that are drawing on the previous texts, which are what we have represented in our Bibles today.
So basically what we have is Muhammad drawing from sources that are sourced in, that are interpretations of what we have today of the scriptures, but they're just different. They're flowing through different schools of thought. And so if he's being exposed, like you said, in this area, there's a bunch of different religions, It's not just that there's only polytheism that's totally divorced from any sort of monotheism. It exists, and these books are accessible. These stories are being told. And so it's, yeah, so you would say the majority of what's being recounted in the Quran is from the retelling of stories from the Torah and things like that.
I would say that you could probably account for every story in the Quran that's a history from a story that was circulating at the time, that he's drawing from. So, and we could go through like a lot of examples of those things. But I also would say that it's not that he didn't introduce anything new, but it's not very much that he introduced new. He introduced himself as the prophet, right? Like a lot of times, Brother Rashid will say, you know, what new thing did he bring? What new thing did Islam bring? And that's a really good question for Muslims. What did he say that wasn't already said?
Well, I've posed this challenge on my page several times. Can you name one teaching in Islam that's superior to what Jesus already taught? That's like objectively a superior teaching. And there's nothing. There's nothing in the teaching. In fact, it downgrades. It actually is going backwards with some of this, you know, slavery and concubinage and all of that. But so and yeah, maybe in the future that'd be another video we can do, is trying to trace a lot of the source material, how you would go about doing that, and what sources to look at. But we won't get into that now. So drawing upon that, so he's presenting himself as this prophet that's in the lineage of these. So at first, he comes from a tribe that was primarily polytheist. And so there's this, when you look at Islam, you see kind of a mix of like traditions from all these different religions that are kind of molded together. And it's almost like he's trying to navigate and appease. He's trying to appease everybody, especially in the early days, while introducing monotheism. So he's bringing in certain practices that were rooted in the pagan practices. But at the same time, he's trying, how early in his career as a prophet was he trying to win Jews and Christians? And by Christians, who were the Christians? These were non-Jews who were, you know, following Jesus, right? There were Byzantine, maybe Coptic. I know, anyways, who was influencing. All that to say is, who was he trying to convince early on? Was he focused on just the polytheist? And did he, you know, did he really say like Jews and Christians have their own thing and they can stay what they are? And then at one point, because eventually when he gains power, now he uses military and he uses the sword to kind of enforce what he wanted to win them over with. So let's talk a little bit about maybe that aspect of why the Quran has so much, it's just a mix of different sources, because it seems like he's trying to win everybody, and he convinces the polytheists to unite. But
the environment he was in, there were lots of different peoples there. Okay. And as I understand it, the Kaaba had people were worshiping all manner of different religions. And it was a very religious area. There were other religious centers around. And there's even a picture of the Messiah, of Jesus and Mary in the Kaaba that was there. So there was all manner of religions represented in Mecca at the time. And so they also, the Qurayshi people had kind of a tolerance for other religions. They just didn't, their bone to pick with Muhammad was that he said, La ilaha illallah. So there's no other God but Allah. And they said, well, don't say that, you know, that's going too far. Okay. And so that was kind of the frustration they had with him. And probably also the whole thing where he's someone they were familiar with, and who is he to come out and bring something new, you know? But I think that his target is obviously in the earlier revelations is more general, like to the Qurayshi people. And it's not that he would been also speaking to Christians too, because there are some things in there. But you see a lot of references to talking about the idols and some of the practices of the polytheists and some of the earlier revelations. But when he moves to Medina, right? Yeah. And when he moves to Medina, he's working with Aus Hazraj, and then these prominent Jewish tribes. Right. and they're making a pact together. It's politically and militarily advantageous that he get on the right terms with them. And so there was some time where he was trying to get on the same page as them. We see in the second year after Hijrah, though, he kind of started revamping his religion, and he changed a lot of things, and the Jews didn't like that. But they had a pact together, and they were both the Jews were against the polytheists as well, and so he wanted to be on the same page as them. And his enemy at that point earlier on would see, and his focus would be the Qurayshi people, right? Not that he didn't have critiques for the Jews as well.
Sure. So
those got worse as the tensions grew between them.
Right. So basically a lot of what is being recorded in his recitation or bringing in these other sources is to try to convince those who are practicing polytheism that there has been this line of monotheistic, of those who believed in one Allah. And I've been called by Allah to bring this in and follow in that. At what point did he, because to me it seems like, because I think this is why there's a lot of internal conflict when you read the Quran in the way it presents, because if he's trying to just prove to the polytheists that you should become monotheists, and these are all later developed terms anyways, but you should follow the one God and he's the only God. And so he's trying to use all these historic sources and stories to say, like, I'm just doing what they did. And they actually, what I'm doing, look at what they did. I'm doing the same thing. At what point did he turn and maybe start thinking, well, maybe I'm not just a warner who's come to bring people into the, monotheism, that there's one God, but maybe I am actually like a final messenger that's supposed to correct and fix the people of the book and the Jews. Do you understand? Like, I'm trying to get into the mind of the progression, because to me, it does seem like a lot of what I read in the Quran is just trying to convince polytheists. And it doesn't, I haven't seen, at least in the Quran, where it actually places Christians in the category of being idolaters. It does? Okay. But I've seen both, though, because I even saw a guy describing who a Muslim's allowed to marry. And he says, you can't marry idolaters, but you can marry Christians. And you can marry, like he gives this criteria of who you're allowed to.
They still are able to have the status of zimmi.
Okay.
But in the same verses you'd be talking about in chapter 9, following the command to attack them, he kind of explains in that chapter that they're polytheists as well. And that's why it's kind of a justification, as it seems.
Okay. So is there a point in the Quran, like you would see in the Quran or in the life of Muhammad, where he turns to, I guess maybe, and I'm not even framing it correctly, where he starts thinking, oh, I need to can either convince Jews and Christians to follow me as their authority, or because to me, it seems like the Quran presents both concepts. Which surah was it the other day? Was it Surah 4? Where it says that Allah says, why do they come to you when they already have the Torah? Judge between them, let them judge between themselves. And if you judge between them, judge justly, which the context is probably talking about. He's gained some sort of political authority in that region. And so Jews are coming to him for judgment. And Allah literally says in this passage, why are they coming to you when they already have the Torah to judge between themselves? And then it goes into Israel had Moses in his book, the Injil and Jesus. They were to judge by that. And then, and so then are they supposed to come to Muhammad for judgment, or do they have to submit to Muhammad? Otherwise, at what point, was there a point where Muhammad's like, yeah, you got to submit to my message and leave what you're leaving? But then the question is, what did he introduce new that the Jews didn't already believe, I guess?
But it was, submission to him, right? The prophet of the day. So at the beginning, when he first came, he comes in and he's got these pacts that he has with the Jews and the Christians there. Bani Qurayza, Bani Nadir, and Bani Qaynuqa. And there were various, rubbings up with one another during the whole time. Maybe one of the more significant ones was the issue in Bani Qaynuqa, which probably is on the outskirts of town. And with one of the Muslim women getting kind of molested, maybe. And there was an outbreak of anger and a fight broke out, and he came in there. But this was after they had fought at the Battle of Badr. And so when he came to them, he said to Bani Qaynuqa, these Jews, he says, if I'm going to do to you, if you don't become Muslim, right, then I'm going to do to you what I did to the polytheists at Badr. Okay. Right? And he ended up expelling Bani Qaynuqa. So there was a process that developed over the time where he goes through expelling these tribes for one reason or another until he's cleansed out all of Medina from the Jews, and then he goes after Khaybar and some of these other places. And so there was a process in developing relationship throughout that time. There was one of the battles, what was it called? Handuk, Battle of Handuk, the trenches, where some of the Jews, this is after Bani Qaynuqa, so I mean they're kind of probably thinking, what's going on here? After the second year, he had changed some of his ordinances. Now we're not facing Jerusalem anymore, and we're facing Mecca. What's the deal with these things? They were kind of disenchanted with the whole Islam the way it was, but they had this pact between them. So they were kind of thinking maybe if the Muslims got defeated, maybe they could kind of wiggle out of this situation. So they did send some sort of an envoy or something behind Muhammad's back to kind of talk with the enemy and say, well, if you win, we can work something out, yeah. Right. Well, Muhammad got wind of this and he's upset. So he turns around right after the battle and comes after him. This wasn't a battle. When he came after Bani Qurayza, he came after them, took them out, slaughtered a bunch of them in the trenches there. And there was a lot of bad blood after Bani Qaynuqa, as you can imagine, because he told them they had to become Muslim. Right. So verses like La Iqra fil Din, those came down at the early Medinan period when he's just arrived there. Says there's no compulsion religion. It was kind of like a peace pact between the two of them. And then he comes over and he says, he's changed his vibe now, and he's saying you gotta follow,
which is
Islam.
Is that classified as an abrogation? Where has that verse been abrogated? Talk a little bit about
so that verse,
the convenience of abrogation.
So people don't. I think that most scholars and most Muslims don't want to see a lot of verses with abrogation written underneath of it. Right. But it is if you read through the tafsirs, you can see for most verses that have some sort of a conflicting verse like we have in this one. Right. So you have La Iqra fil Din here, and then Faqtulul Mushrikin Kayta Wajadtuhum, and then kill the polytheists wherever you find them. Right. In chapter 9. And chapter 9 came afterwards. Obviously, on the day when he says go and fight the polytheist, you can't say La Iqra fil Din. I can't. There's no compulsion in religion. So for the scholars that are wanting to know how this all works, you have to kind of work this issue out. Every verse came down in a context. Like I said, almost all of this can be explained just by chronology. Simply once he got an army and he started ambushing, you see verses, he starts commanding those types of things throughout the chronology. And before that, you have when he's in a position where he's doesn't have an army, or he's like they're the underdogs. Then you have these other, lakum dinikum wali dini, and these ayat like that. There is a little bit of nuance, but almost all of it is it's easiest way to explain it. The simplest way to explain it is abrogation. Now you can break it, throw away the word, and have the same thing. And so I think that's what you find on La Iqra fil Din. Some people say, well, it was this Jewish woman who was telling these kids they need to be Jewish. She was kind of compelling them to follow the Jewish religion, or it was Christians. Or no, what this verse is talking about is like Christians, Jews, they are on a different thing. When you come to the mushrikeen, you kill them unless they become Muslim. But if it's a a Jew or a Christian, then they can pay jizya. Hum saghirun, they're humiliated, and if they expect that they accept that humiliated state in the community, then you can leave them be. And so that's not forcing them. So we have these types of interpretations. All of them, in my opinion, are just reconciling the texts, and we know that because the latter text is the command to go and fight, right, and do jihad, that one is the one that is applicable, right, at the time now.
How do you know something has been is abrogation an eternal, does the Quran talk about abrogation, or is that imposed on?
No,
the
Quran talks about abrogation. Okay. It kind of defines it itself.
Okay.
The kind of things that it is.
But is everything that's classified as abrogation, does the Quran say it? So even though the Quran might define abrogation, that concept, do scholars and Islamic teachers, do they impose that definition onto different verses when they conflict?
You can't use the Quran to tell you this verse is an abrogated verse.
Okay.
And so that is why I would say that the Quran came down. If the Quran if you consider it as a complete book, the form of the complete book is contradictory.
Right, exactly.
In its form. And the reason is because it came in a chronology, and it's updating itself and correcting itself. Man nansakh min ayat al nunsiha nati min khayran minha al mithlaha. So in Surah 2:106, we have kind of the idea of abrogation explained. We don't cause any verses to be abrogated or forgotten unless we bring one that's better or another one in likeness to it. So this is describing the whole idea of it. So in other words, he's constantly updating things. So,
well, even that phrase, which is better, how does a Muslim, because again, I don't want to misrepresent it, but from hearing it, it sounds like there's a better concept or truth that's going to be revealed later because it was an inferior truth, or
think of it like clarification. So he says that after you divorce your wives, before they can be remarried, or after the husband passes away, before they can get remarried, you have to wait 3 periods. Okay, well that's fairly clear, but then some people came and they were like, hey, what about people that don't have periods? What do you do for them? And as for them, you say you wait 3 months. So he just adds that particular type of abrogation is just an update.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And like I said, you don't have to go around and call these things abrogations. The Quran does say it abrogates itself. Right. So it fits under that category. But when you're discussing with a Muslim, if you want to say something's abrogated, it's good to have a source that says this verse was abrogated. That means that the scholars like Imam Suyuti or somebody who studied the text says this one is abrogated by this verse, and everybody understands it that way. And in that sense, the things that are truly contradictory in regards to commands are already marked by nasikh and mansukh, right? By the abrogating verse and the verse that's abrogated, by these tafsirs, right? And it's not that the idea of abrogation is completely bizarre, really. Sure. Because over time it makes sense that it's something fitting a context needs to be adjusted. Yeah. And if you don't believe that, then you inevitably do it anyway because of the times change, right? Sure, yeah. But there's another thing to be said by the frequency and the kinds of abrogations that happen. Okay. That evokes criticism, and it evoked criticism during the time of Muhammad.
Okay, and that a lot of times they'll say things about it seems like it's just very convenient. And I guess I want to bring up one of the criticisms toward the Bible. I'll see comments on my videos all the time where Muslims will say, "Oh, which new update of your version of the Bible do we have to follow?" Things like that. And it's what are you even talking about? But 2, that's literally what's happening over the span of 23 years is that there's these updates and clarifications, and okay, that doesn't apply anymore. And to me, it doesn't make sense in such a short time period. There would have to be so many revisions and updates. It does, like, just objectively speaking, not just because I'm not a Muslim, but objectively speaking, it just looks like it's being made up on the fly, and you're using Allah as your scapegoat for authority to justify the decisions you're making as you go. So, like, yeah, I'm sure you have a couple examples, but it seems so obvious that a situation arises and he says, "Oh yeah, this is what Allah's told me." Like marrying his adopted son's wife.
He just replaces one ayah with another.
Right.
Yeah. The problem is that when things are close together like that, the human element gets magnified.
Yeah.
And so it does look like he's just making things up, but especially if it applies to his own personal things, like,
right.
Yeah, don't bother the prophet when he's in his home, or like you can't marry his wives after he dies. All these things that seem to like kind of like be convenient revelations.
Right.
Like Surah 33 is really the best chapter to go to if you want to see examples of ayat that seem just like they're coming straight out of his flesh, you know.
Right.
I mean, right. So we could go through some of those if you want to.
Yeah, let's do that real quick, and then we'll finish up doing that, and then maybe we'll look at the Farid video as our last thing. But yeah, because isn't Surah 33 is also the one that there was supposed to be like more ayahs, right? More verses.
Right. So that chapter was supposed to be much bigger. It has the famous suckling of adults.
Right.
Yeah.
Because that's supposed to have something to do with like inheritance law. And things
so
like
the
that,
whole
right?
chapter, it's all wrapped up in together. It's like one thread. You pull one thing in the chapter, and the whole thing starts unraveling. So for a lot of people, the end of Islam is chapter 33.
Okay, right.
So you take somebody through chapter 33, and it's a big mess.
Okay.
It's really frustrating.
Right. Now, obviously, for the Christian who's wanting to learn Islam, just before we go to Surah 33, if a Christian wants to walk through Surah 33 and understand it, you talk about tafsir, you talk about hadith, and you talk about sirah.
Sirah is the biography literature. Yeah.
Okay. How would someone who's new to this, like, let me start with chapter 33, how would they walk through without on your own? I think there's enough resources online. If you don't have a Muslim friend who actually knows this, or you don't have like an ustaz teaching you or an imam, what could a Christian do to make sure they're accurately representing, you know, what they're trying to refute? First of all, how do you know to go to which hadith, tafsir, sirah? I'm sure it's probably a complicated answer.
For like someone who's new to these things, or is just kind of dabbling in it, the best thing to do is to go to the sirah.
Okay.
So the sirah is written by Muslim sources, and so they're going to cast things in a certain light, right? Right. But you can get a chronology, which you can't get in the Quran. Okay. You can get a general idea of everything that was going to happen. Order of events, it helps with that. A lot of the sirahs will have like a table in the back that kind of can help you know the year, okay, and look up the things you're looking for. And once you have a sirah, you can kind of jump around and use it as like, okay, where are we in the events of his life? Right. Because we're really used to reading a story in the Bible, and it goes first this, then that, and the Quran, we don't have that. Okay. So you're just picking up chapter 33. You're just kind of picking up out of nowhere. Right. So always I think if I was going to go back and do things, if you want to know Islam well, you start with the biography. Okay. And then you can move into the Quran itself. It can be really difficult to understand because of the way it's written. Mm-hmm. And you don't know the context. So the other books you need is Asbab al-Nuzul, which is the reason for the revelations. It's probably by Al-Wahidi, and there's probably others. And the best sirah, by the way, is almost all of them are based out of Ibn Hisham, which was Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq put those together. And they're survived through Ibn Hisham. And now Hisham, just to give us a context,
Hisham was how many years after Muhammad actually lived?
I don't have it right in my head, but it's about 150, I think.
Okay.
Okay, so like
and that's to say
maybe 120 to 150.
Because I do want to kind of give context of that too. It's another topic, but just real quick, Christians here, Muslims criticize the timeline of when scriptures were recorded in relation to the events, and they think that 30 years after Jesus was on earth is a long time, or even 50, 60 years after is a long time. And it can be, but it's still within the lifetime of those who lived during Jesus' time. So we have here the majority of the you refer to all of the literature as Sunnah, and the Kabir are reports, right? So like
the Hadith,
the Hadith, all of this literature, we're not discrediting it necessarily. I mean, some Muslims are actually acknowledging that there's not much historic credibility to them, but it's kind of a similar objection. If they're going to object to Christianity and the way that our literature was recorded and when it was recorded, well, it's problematic with theirs. So we kind of got to give, if you're speaking to a Muslim and they're like, well, I don't give any credibility to your books because of what, these scholars say when it was recorded, that kind of is problematic for Islam as well. And we're not trying to discredit them, right? Or is it kind of is it a situation where we're in the same thing here, or is it?
I generally don't consider the formation of the Bible and the manuscript evidence to be exactly analogous to the Quran.
Right. Okay.
If we're talking about the Quran, if we're talking about the Hadith is it's oral traditions that are later recorded. So the assumption is these oral traditions, some of them look to have been passed down from each person to each person, such that we have some level of assurance that this oral tradition is more likely to be accurate. But in Islamic scholarship, they just throw things out when it doesn't, don't like it, right? So they do consider the isnad and all the who passed it down and things, but they'll throw something out if it's problematic for Islam, right? And so that's why you get this sense where you'll talk with some Muslim friends, you'll pull up a source, and if a lot of them will reject it and not think twice about it. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll get to Surah 33. So you got the Sirah, Hadith, Tafsir are commentaries that are different than Hadith, then, right? We're just giving a basic like Islam 101. The Hadith are the oral traditions that through the chain of Ishnad, they're supposed to be what either Muhammad said himself.
Yeah, so companions of the Prophet, people that live with him, recounting things that they saw or heard.
Okay.
And it also includes, Hadith also includes the companions of the Prophet and things that they said.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And
then Tafsir or commentary are Tafsir earlier than like the biography. Well, I mean, obviously they trace the Sirah back to Ishaq.
So which was, I think the Sirah will be predates the Hadiths.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So the Hadiths would come later as far as a compilation of them. Of course, we're assuming that the Hadith existed up until that point in time.
Right.
And then Ibn Ishaq, during the Abbasid Caliph, and he was, asked to make a book from Adam to Muhammad, like what we see with the Jews and Christians.
Okay. Yeah.
Generally, his hadiths aren't accepted, even though he made the Sirah. Bayhaqi, his I guess, what is that called? Talib. English went away there for a second. His apprentice or whatever. Bayhaqi was his student, and then he passed it on to Hisham. We don't have Bayhaqi's copy or Ibn Ishaq's copy, but we have Ibn Hisham's edit of it, and it was problematic. There were things that he was attributing to people who didn't say, and so it's there's a lot of question about it in and of itself. It's not a lot of things that he's saying on his own authority, and Muslims today just take them as is, even though it's not even necessarily from a hadith sometimes. So it's just him saying it.
Okay.
So, and we have there's other literature as well. The tafsirs are from various time periods throughout Muslim history,
Okay.
and they're affected by their geopolitical events that are going on at the time.
And what weight in these four genres of literature: Sirah, Hadith, Tafsir, Quran? Obviously, Quran is at the top and is not comparable to the others in authority. What weight of authority do they give in Islamic scholarship? Obviously, not Western scholarship. Do they give to, obviously, the Sirah as a biography? They give a lot of weight to it, but not with any like sort of the way they give it. Hadith, they use the Ishnad to tie it back to the early days, but the Sirah, it's a different approach to how they legitimize it.
Yeah, they're all kind of tied in together.
Okay.
Because the Quran is explained by the tafsirs. Those would probably have the least authority. The Hadith would have more, and also the Sirah uses a lot of the Hadith, and puts the Quran in context, and so the explanatory power alone kind of makes it an authority.
Okay, I see. Good. So we come to chapter 33, and we're talking about kind of just how the human element seems so obvious with, and again, I'm always thinking of the comparison of objections that Muslims have toward Christianity, and I do like to grant Muslims their belief if it helps reinforce what Christianity teaches, meaning now you have to face the content, like you have to look at the content of what's said in context. And I guess what comes to my mind is they look at verses where Jesus makes absolute definitive statements about his humanity, because we do believe he's fully human. He took on real humanity. And so he's going to speak as a human, but they'll just take that and box it up and say that Jesus is claiming to only be a human, not divine origin, any of that. And so I guess what we can do is we're going to look at 33, and it just seems obvious that he's using Allah as to justify, as I like going to what Aisha said. It seems like Allah hastens to fulfill your desires, which just seems so obvious. This is very human that, okay, we'll discuss that, how it just looks convenient. Anybody reasoning who's a man will be like, yeah, if I could say Allah is going to give me this, then man, I'm going to do it. However, if we grant it that, okay, for the Muslims, we'll grant you that Allah did reveal this, okay, to him, this very human element, but you got to grant that the way we categorize and understand Jesus' teaching, you've got to grant that then. You can't just, that's kind of what I'm getting at. So let's look at the human element of like Surah 33.
Okay, yes. So this is Surah 33. You probably want to start with verse 5. And there's 3 issues that are tied in here together that all kind of, you pull on one, you find out all the rest. So it's kind of a strange thing that we find in Islam that, adoption is prohibited in Islam. So that came out of these things we're about to read. So Zayd is the only companion of the Prophet mentioned in the Quran. And it's in this surah we find him. This is the same surah we find where he talked about he's the Khatim al-Anbiya, and he's the seal of the prophets, right? And so there's a lot of big statements that are elevating to Muhammad to a high authority in this particular thing. So that's significant about this chapter as well. It's the chapter when you see in Allahu malaikati yasalluna al-nabi, and we see the famous verse that everybody's always dogging on that says that God and the angels prayed upon the Prophet.
Oh, okay.
Well, this is the story, So in verse 33:5, he says, "Let your adopted children keep their family names." Well, what was happening at the time when this particular verse came down, check your tafsirs, this is kind of talking about Zayd. So Zayd was a young man that he raised as his son, and people referred to him as Zayd ibn Muhammad at the time. And he married Zayd and Zayd was of a lower caste, and he married Zayd to Zainab bint Jash. And she was beautiful. Like he married him, but Zayd was a little bit embarrassed about it because he's from a lower caste, and Muhammad kept saying, "Yeah, this is fine." In any case, after a while, it became clear. Now we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. I can give you the meaty story if you want it from other sources. Right. But if you read it in some of the seerah material, they try to dumb it down a little bit. Basically, they would say Zayd was a little bit embarrassed of her. He felt like Zainab was a little too noble for him. Okay. And he came 3 times asking for divorce with her. But there was a lot of talk already as a result. These verses are a testimony to fact that something was going on in the community. There was a lot of talk going on. Because this verse says, let your adopted children keep their family names. Something happened between Muhammad and Zainab. And Zayd kept on pursuing him until he said, okay, I'll divorce you. So he gave Zainab to Zayd ibn Muhammad at that time, and who was adopted, and then something happened between them two, and Zayd gets embarrassed, and then there's a lot of talk. And so to quiet the talk down, he sends down this verse. He says, let your adopted children keep their family names. That is more just in the sight of Allah. So you shouldn't call him Zayd ibn Muhammad anymore. Call him by his father's name. They're simply your fellow believers or associates. There's no blame for what you do by mistake, but what you do intentionally. So if you intentionally go around and keep saying, look at him, there's something going on between Muhammad and Zainab, and that's his son. Right? That seems scandalous to the Arabs at the time. Right. So to alleviate the scandal, the first step was to get rid of adoption because he's no longer a son. Right. Right. So let's go to another verse. إِذَا تَقُولَ الَّذِينَ أَنْعَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَأَنْعَمْتُ عَلَيْهِ. So in verse 37 of the same chapter 33, he says, and remember, O Prophet, when you said to the one for whom Allah has done favor, and you too have done a favor. He's talking about Zayd there, right? Okay. He said he did him a favor, and he gave Zayd to him as a wife, right? But he says, keep your wife and fear Allah. So I got to back up a little bit. Let's go back here. I need to read this one too. I guess we can just skip this part. Verse 36 too is kind of like the verse that he kind of married. I've seen in some tafsirs before that it's referencing him when he married Zayd to Zainab bint Jahsh. And the next verse is him getting married to her. Muhammad getting married to her. This is the verse that came down for that. إِذَا تَقُولُ لِلَّذِينَ أَنْعَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَأَنْعَمْتُ عَلَيْهِ أَمْسِكْ عَلَيْكَ زَوْجَكَ. So, O Prophet, remember when it was said to the one for whom Allah has done a favor, and to you, and you too. I don't know what this translation's like. What is this? Yeah, okay, fine, whatever. We'll just let them say whatever they want to say. O Prophet, when you said to the one for whom Allah has done a favor, and you too have done a favor, keep your wife and fear Allah, while concealing within yourself what Allah was going to reveal. And so you were considering the people, whereas Allah is more worthy of your consideration. So he says that there's something that he's saying the Prophet is embarrassed about something in verse 37. And the tafsirs explained to what he was embarrassed about was basically that God had put, passion between him and Zainab bint Jahsh, which is his adopted son's now former wife. And it says, well, you're afraid of what people are saying about you, when really you should be afraid of what God says. And he says,
Yeah.
and then he says, لِمَا قَدَّ زَيْدٌ مِنْهَا وَطْرًا. And then when Zayd was completely finished with her, زَوَجْنَاكَ. Yeah, so زَوَجْنَاكَهَا. So we married her to you. And then it goes on to kind of make this as an kind of cover up the whole thing by saying like that's so that other people, if they have adopted sons, they can marry their wives once their adoptive sons are through with him. So
it just obviously it just seems in the order. Obviously, there's
okay, so this creates problems.
yeah.
So like let's go back over that one more time. What happened is he married Zayd at that time, Ibn Muhammad, as he was called, but he was an adopted son, to Zainab bint Jahsh, who was of a noble class. Something went on between him and Zainab, and Zayd didn't think he was worthy of her, according to the Sirah. And then Zayd wants to back out of the marriage. There's a lot of talk, like something's going on with Muhammad wanting to marry her in town, and it's frustrating him, so he's outlaws adoption. And so Zayd is no longer referred to as his son.
Now there is in this timeline, you will hear a lot of Christians use the story, and is this a legit source where Muhammad went to visit Zayd and he caught a glimpse of her in a revealing outfit.
Right. So there's several accounts of this. All of them are typically rejected by your average Muslim because that's embarrassing.
Just because it's embarrassing, but does it come from legit sources?
Like I mentioned earlier, you can kind of pick and choose with sources.
Okay.
If you don't like it, just find something wrong with it, right? And it can be as simple as it says something bad about the prophet, right? Or insinuates something bad about the prophet. That's enough.
But this phrase right here in verse 37, but you did hide in your heart that which Allah was about to make manifest, seems like there was something going on in his heart, him being drawn to her, right? And he's like, he was trying to suppress it, is what it sounds like. And now he's justifying it by saying, oh, Allah told me that I shouldn't hide it. Because verse 36 says...
Yeah, the implication is there either way, no matter... Yeah. I mean, we read it in the tafsirs that are explicit and say, well, he saw her and was attracted to her.
Yeah.
That is implied in this text.
Yeah.
I've had discussions with religious leaders about this, and they would say, well, we reject all of the hadiths about these things. I said, even if you reject all of them, the whole story is in the chapter.
Right.
He starts by getting rid of adoption. He proceeds to marry his adopted son's wife and being embarrassed about it.
Right.
So
Muhammad was embarrassed
about it. This is, Aisha said, this was, if there was any verse that Muhammad could have got taken out of the Quran because he was embarrassed about it, it was this one. I can give you that hadith as well.
Now, verse 38 is following this story, right? Because I've heard Muslims explain that everything Muhammad did was to demonstrate how we should respond to circumstances and live our life. So this whole incident was not that he was, had the hots for her. It was nothing to do with that. It was so that Allah could show by a real life example why you can't have adoption, in order that you can maintain the inheritance of the original father's name or whatever. Then they'll make it about inheritance and keeping your name and all of that and honoring all that. But this following verse, one, is that a legit understanding? Two, verse 38 says, this seems to be the reason why this all happened. There can be no, what's the Arabic for this? There can be no difficulty to the prophet and what Allah has indicated to him as a duty. In other words, we don't want, and I've read another.
ما كان على نبي من حرج فيما فرض الله.
What does that mean? No difficult, like
there's no, it says discomfort here. I don't know if that's right. That'd be more like blame. Gofol, we say in Gofol alanama, and we say in Pula, that is like a mistake or blame or Guapo is, it's like, generally speaking, it's a mistake.
So basically it's saying that like Allah approved this, you can't put this on Muhammad as being
وَكَانَ عَلَى نَبِيًّا مِنْ هَرَجًا فِيمَا فَرَضَ اللَّهُ. There's no blame on him for doing what he was ordained to do.
okay.
That's what it's saying.
Okay.
So, but the reason it's silly to kind of speculate as why this verse came down is because it's built into the 37th verse what it's for. His practical application is that لِكَيْ لَا يَكُونَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ حَرَجٌ, so that it won't be you won't be blamed if you marry your adopted son's wives once they're finished with them, right? So it's kind of like whoa, never thought that would be an issue.
Yeah.
You know.
Exactly.
So it really this is the reason that a lot of people leave Islam for these type of things, because this is very clearly something that has to do with his flesh.
Right.
Very clear to something else, and it seems like a quick save to say, well, I just wanted to fit for everybody so they can do the same thing.
Yeah.
But when it obviously these two revelations coming in tandem have personal benefits, you know. The verses continue to do the same kind of thing through the rest of the chapter.
Well, very good. Well, I think obviously verse 53. O you who believe, enter not the prophet's houses until leave is given you for a meal, and not so early as to wait for his preparation. Mm-hmm. But when you are invited, enter, and when you have taken your meal, disperse without seeking familiar talk. Such behavior annoys, they translate it, they misspell it, but in this version, such behavior annoys the prophet. He feels shy to ask you to leave, but Allah does not feel shy to tell you the truth. Mm-hmm. It's almost a split. To me, it seems like a split personality here.
It's crazy. This particular verse is just dripping with personal benefits. He's bringing a revelation to kind of get people to kind of do what he wants them to do.
Right. So so Surah 33 just seems to be those who annoy Allah.
It goes on to say that you can't marry his wives after him. He just packs it all in.
Exactly. Look at verse 57. Because I'm just reading right now and pulling this up. What's the word annoy mean? Now he has with vex or cause pain. Those who annoy Allah and his apostle. Okay.
We translate that in Fular to tampini. So that tampini would be wazuna is like give a hard time, offend. Mm.
How can Allah be offended by a human? Can he be tempted? Can Allah be tempted? Is this fall in that category? So just the Prophet of Allah?
No, it's Allah wa rasuluhu.
Wa rasuluhu.
Yeah, so it's God and the Prophet.
Okay, right.
It's they're together. They're giving. If you give the Prophet a hard time, you're giving Allah a hard time. So they're cursed in there.
I've heard Muslims miscategorize what temptation means. They say, well, God cannot be tempted, but then Jesus was tempted in the wilderness. So how can he be God if he was tempted? But this kind of, and again, this has just stood out to me as I was reading through here, those who annoy Allah. I mean, how can Allah be annoyed? Like, it seems like somebody who gets annoyed is somebody who's petty, somebody who has no patience. Like I get annoyed when I step outside the front door and 50 kids surround me saying, give me something, give me something. I get annoyed by that, but then I step back and realize they have nothing and they need attention. Like I can rise above getting annoyed. Somebody gets annoyed, unless there's a different word, unless that's a bad translation in my
it says just this one translates it as offend.
Offend.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, well, he has here in the footnotes vex or cause pain, which again, how can you cause pain to Allah?
It's just referring. It might just be metaphorical, referring to frustration is when he says that.
Yeah. Okay.
So frustration.
And those
the reason it's interesting in these verses is because the prophet's the one frustrated, and now he's saying that Allah is frustrating.
Okay.
He's saying right. So the prophet is frustrated. So he receives a revelation which comes out of his own mouth, saying the thing explaining the frustration that he has for him. So he's actually explaining with his own mouth the frustration that's within him. And then But yes, he just says it's God's telling him that. So that's very strange.
In verse 59.
Verse 50 is also another one 50. People look at, right? Yeah, you're gonna be.
Oh yeah, that's what I've.
Yeah, so, O Prophet, we made lawful you for your wives, and then it goes on to say,
cousins.
In wahabad nafsaha, if she gives herself to the Nabi, to the Prophet, in arad nabiyyu an yastankiha, if the Prophet wants to marry her, khalas. That is something especially for you, min dunil mu'minin, not for the rest of the believers. So when you read the tafsirs of this, they explain that the Prophet was able to take more wives, and he could take wives without mahir or what's that called in English? Dowry or witnesses. He didn't have to have all the witnesses.
Really?
Yeah.
So she comes and offers herself to him.
Yeah.
So essentially, hypothetically, a woman could come, offer herself to him. He doesn't need dowry, doesn't need witnesses, claims that they get married, and then is there any evidence that? I guess I'm trying to get at, like, this would allow him with the concept of divorce. Like, you can just say divorce 3 times, you're divorced. Now, did Muhammad ever divorce anybody? Is there any evidence?
So it goes on, I think, and after that, to kind of explain, you can't just divorce somebody to marry somebody else. That's in verse 52.
Because I guess it just seems like this could be a setup for a one-night stand. Like, a woman shows up, like, want to give yourself to the Prophet. Okay, let's get married, and then, like, you could just divorce her the next day. I'm not saying this happened.
Well, that would be really offensive to say say it that way.
Of course,
Muslim,
but
he had privileges. He had privileges that other people didn't have, and some of these privileges are outlined here, and they're sexual privileges.
Right.
So,
and the next verse says that. Is it right in the verse? The reason why he has these privileges is because he doesn't want Allah doesn't want Muhammad to be burdened, right? Like, he wants him to enjoy himself. Defer any of them you please, and you may receive any you please and blame on you. If you invite one, is set aside. They were closely gleaming in the eyes. We know that we have appointed them for wives and captains' right hands in order that there should be no difficulty. There's that word again. We're doing this so there's no difficulty for you. So there's an exception for you to fulfill your fleshly desires, because we don't want there to be any difficulty for you, which again, it just seems very convenient.
Yeah. This whole chapter is just full of questionable revelations that are for personal benefit. They're not for all of the believers, they're specifically for him. And so these are when these verses are revealed, is when you have Aisha saying, I only see your Lord hastening to your flesh, basically, your passions.
Verse 52, just maybe clarification on this. It says it's not lawful for you. Is it speaking to Muhammad to marry more women after this?
Yes, to Muhammad.
After what? After, like, was there a cap on how many, or was it in order to change them for other wives? So you can't just divorce to marry somebody else, even though their beauty should attract you. Obviously, he was, he was attracted to women, except any your right hand should possess. So
yes, there's an exemption for that. So this is talking about the practice of divorcing a woman to take another one.
Okay.
Right. And you can't do that.
Okay.
Right.
But he could add wives.
Yeah, he could add wives. And they had a practice then of trading out wives. The tafsir of this one goes on to talks about how someone came over and he was in the room with Aisha. And he saw him with Aisha, and he came in without knocking, so he's being a little rude and just playing around with Muhammad. And he said, "Hey, I want my wife's prettier than she is. You want to switch?" And he says, "No, God doesn't permit that anymore." Yeah.
So they were into that. But this phrase right here, "except any your right hand should possess," that's talking about slave women, right?
Yeah.
And so in Islamic, is that just okay, guys? Is that just for Muhammad, or could any Muslim who owns a slave woman use her for sexual gratification?
Yes. So in chapter 4, we can look at that one too. That ordinance came down. There's a hadith that goes with it as well.
Okay.
So this one particular is talking about Muhammad.
Yeah,
Man malakat yaminuk. So yaminuka is his those he possesses. I was right. His right hand possesses. But and so if we go to Surah 4, all right. Surah Nisa, the 24 probably. Yep, 24. So he's listing here those who are forbidden to marry, right? And verse 24, he continues on with the list, and he says, "Muhsinatu min al-nisa'i illa man malakat aymanikum." So you are forbidden to marry married women, except captives. So married women that are captives, you can marry. So there was a problem, you know. They were talking about, well, I don't know, they went to war and they captured a bunch of women. They were like, oh, we can't sleep with them because their husbands are still alive. And then he sent this verse down, you know, to kind of clear that up.
Okay.
They don't count. So that's where that one comes from. I should have pulled up all my sources, all my list of things all together on here for you. Make it a lot easier just to read through things. There's a whole bunch of extra privileges here. Get a dib. I have a whole bunch of studies on women in Islam. So like this is a huge subject. Actually, like I can go through specific women, and what the issues like them. Maria al-Qibtiyya. So she's the slave that they got from Egypt, right? And then he had Ibrahim with. So there's that interesting story. We've got his daughter named Zainabu, and the love story between her and a pagan guy, her husband. They really loved each other. And then we have Safiya bint Huyay. She was captured at Khaybar, her husband killed and her father killed. And then she was on the way back. He copulated with her. And we have Aisha story. So we've got a whole bunch.
Yeah, I think it'd be a good. There are a lot of Western women. You know.
Like there's so much material.
Right.
It's just a lot. So like some of this stuff, like what we just went through right now, if we're gonna do that for recording, it'd be best if I sit down and get it really organized, consolidated into things, and go through it rather than jumping around. But the 33rd chapter is a mess. You can just read through it and be like, what the world is going on?